Part 19. Working in the city gas industry. In the summer of 1995, the hot sun was heating up the earth. I got a call from an executive of the City Gas Association. He said he wanted to hire me for the Chief of Planning section, which was vacant. At that time, I had already been assigned as a deputy manager at work. I was troubled for a moment. I hesitated because the proposal by the association was to become a section chief, but I decided to change my job because I thought that the city gas sector, which was growing, would be good. Most of the city gas companies were established by coal mines, coal briquettes, or oil companies. They invested in the city gas industry for business diversification. There was a slight difference between the city gas industry and the workplace before, but the nature and field of work were similar. I thought this would be my last job because I was already in my 40s. The demand for city gas increased markedly. The BC oil that was used mainly for heating in apartments, diesel that was used in individual houses, and LPG that was used for cooking were all being replaced by natural gas. As a household fuel, briquettes were quickly replaced by oil, and then oil was replaced by natural gas. It was a competitive society where everyone could not cope with change. During my school days, I learned that coal reserves in Korea could be used for about 30 years. Within 20 years, however, coal became an inferior material due to the worsening mining conditions. Coal was being replaced by oil in an instant, and the coal industry was on the decline. The days when people used to buy a couple of briquettes and light a fire in the fuel hole of a house became a distant memory. Almost all industries were changing as well. The agricultural society, which was important before the 1960s, was transformed into an industrial society. Now, the high-tech and the service industries are the main ones. Most households in Korea own their own houses, and half of the households lived in apartments. Most of them owned private cars. The streets were overflowing with traffic, and the road expansion was taking place wherever we would go. Wherever you went, Korea was under construction. In the 1990s, after the Seoul Olympics, Koreans seemed to be excited wherever they were in the country. As our country actively entered the international stage and the neighboring Chinese market was revitalized, the president also emphasized on globalization, and the internationalization wave broke out in our society. I was confident in stock investment because I had experience in securities investment, and my major was also business administration. At that time, I had 6 million won in savings and more than 6 million won in retirement. I invested all that money in stocks. I chose J Bank from among the bank stocks since it made investment profits 8 years before. Another reason why I chose the bank stocks was that the bank does not go bankrupt. Everybody who knew the economy said that to be true. The fact that J Bank had a lot of bad loans was a bit of a risk, but its stock price was low. When I bought the stocks, the price of all the stocks in the banking sector dropped unexpectedly. The stock price of J Bank fell more than 20% from the price I bought it at. In the course of the economic development, it seemed that the national economy could develop through government finance, and as a result, large groups of companies seemed to grow like giant dinosaurs. In the meantime, large corporations rushed to borrow money from banks and carry their business like octopus tentacles. Some companies had too much debt, putting a heavy burden on financial institutions, such as banks. The bank was giving a negative account loan to the pay transfer trader as if it were in fashion. Since my high school friend worked at the bank, it was easy for me to get a loan. I made a negative loan account and borrowed 10 million won to buy J Bank stocks with the intention of saving long term. I did what I called a scale trading. The stock price fell again. I did not stop there. I got 7 million won from my father and did scale trading again. The investment was somehow over 35 million won. One day, a sales staff of a securities company called me. He suggested that I should make a diversified investment since I only invested in one stock. I also knew that it was necessary to form a portfolio and to make a diversified investment with a theory of financial management. However, instead of following the theory, I decided to put it in J Bank stock. In December 1997, Korea encountered a financial crisis. Many companies had made reckless investments, carried out corporate management through excessive borrowing, and households had been overspent. It caused the financial crisis. The government declared its default to the international community. We called this an IMF financial crisis, but everyone abbreviated it as IMF. I also knew that IMF stood for the International Monetary Fund because I learned it in high school, but I did not realize that the crisis was a tough price to pay. The sectors that began to feel the most sensitive about the financial crisis were banks and debt-ridden companies. Korea had run out of foreign exchange reserves, and many companies were unable to cover their debts. The average debt ratio of manufacturing companies was at 400%. When IMF decided to provide the nation with a bailout loan, they engaged in our national finances and began restructuring our industries. Interest rates had risen from the previous annual interest rate of 10% to 20%, and there was no money circulating in the market. Many people lost their jobs due to restructuring, and most of the small and medium-sized enterprises and private businesses were saddled with huge debts. In 1997, 17,000 companies were closed. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, the D group I worked for was disbanded, and the affiliate was either liquidated or placed under court receivership. The huge dinosaur of a corporation seemed to collapse. Many of the nation's leading companies had been engulfed in the whirlwind of restructuring. Buildings on Taeheran Street in Gangnam, Seoul, which were very popular, were not being rented and began to vacate. More than half of the buildings were put up for sale at less than half the previous price. Foreign funds began to hunt Korean companies and sucked out domestic money with loans at high interest rates of more than 20% per annum. Some of my relatives lost their lands or fell into bad credit overnight due to the bankruptcy of their businesses. However, the Daesung Group, which I once worked for, was not affected at all under such difficult economic conditions. It was because the company had no debts. Back then, George Soros, who was known as a valuable investor of his international investment company, came to Korea. In Korea, he rated Daesung Group as the most financially sound company. Seeing people fleeing from debt or homelessness in the wake of the financial crisis, I vowed never to be in debt in my life. As the saying goes, a blind trust can kill a person. I felt keenly that it was important to worry about even little things and deal with them thoroughly. Also, I felt that I needed a religious belief when I was in trouble. Some people are desperate when they are in a dilemma, while others are quick to adapt to the difficult situation. Because I have seen cases where religious people have positive thoughts in any situation. The preacher of my church said the following words when he was in trouble. "The sky is open to the top even though the surrounding area seems to be blocked. Pray to God." One day, on my way back to work by my car, I heard an economics section on the traffic broadcasting system. A professor from Seoul National University was emphasizing the 10 commandments on the IMF financial crisis. Sell the stocks you have and reduce your debts as much as you can. Even though I knew the economy a little bit, I could not tell how much the financial crisis affected us. This was because it was the first time I had ever experienced this. In the early days of the situation, most people believed that the government would take care of itself. When the financial crisis occurred, Kim Dae-jung was elected as the president of our country. He declared that he was a prepared president and began to take the situation into account. There was no money in the domestic market. The government took the initiative of corporate restructuring. The bank that we had believed in so far had reached bankruptcy was even worse. The government provided public funds to banks and ordered some of the banks with a severe shortage of funds to close their businesses. The newly established banks, such as the Donghua, the Daedong, the Peace, and the Boram Bank, were closed. J-Bank was no exception. Among large commercial banks, J-Bank had the most serious amount of bad loans. The bank was unable to collect huge amounts of loans to the collapsing group of large companies. As a result, J-Bank had a massive job cut in the restructuring. One of the laid-off employees videotaped the crying of employees inside the bank. People called it the video of tears. Many office workers watched the video and cried together. Most of my high school classmates were working for the banks, the securities, and in charge of corporate finances. As a result, some close friends lost their jobs due to restructuring and wandered away. Investors had been using the term bottom when stock prices had fallen in the stock market, but half-jokingly, they began to say a new term, basement room, as well. J-Bank's stock price continued to fall and fell below 1,001 a share. There was a temporary rebound in stock prices and I had a chance to sell the stocks, but I forgot to place a selling order because of my busy company. After missing this opportunity, the stock price plummeted and I could not sell it. I felt uncomfortable in my bed. When I woke up in the morning, I turned on the TV first and would listen to the news in the car on my way to work. Whenever I got a chance, I read the economic news articles and listened to the broadcasts. There was no good news for months, and the J-Bank situation got worse day by day. My heart ached when I thought of losing my principal investment, but I sold all the stocks at a loss. J-Bank reduced its capital by a ratio of 16-1 and was sold to a foreign bank. In the end, the bank did a great deal of damage to the country and their individual investors. I lost 30 million won in my investment. That was half of my annual salary. I paid the so-called tuition fee to the stock market, and it was a few times more money than I made from investing in bank stocks a decade ago. The financial crisis taught the government, businesses, and individuals that excessive greed leads to one's downfall. In February 1999, the financial crisis affected the city gas industry, which was doing well. As restructuring became popular throughout the country, the association I worked for was also subject to restructuring. At that time, I was a special case, appointed as a full-time director 2 years after I was promoted to manager. I was still young to be a director of the association at that time, but I had no choice. I felt uncomfortable because I had a term of 3 years for the director. Many people said the young blood should be given to the organization. Usually, the members of the association used to appoint people with experience in outside agencies in their 50s as executives. I was puzzled and scared to be an executive who was not ready yet. I was also uncomfortable with the outside view of the association as a lobby group. It was not usually difficult to push for the improvement of related policies or systems on behalf of member companies. It happened when I was 45 years old. The chairman recommended me at that time, and the members agreed unanimously. I was promoted when many office workers were driven out onto the streets. I felt a great sense of responsibility when I was promoted to director. To make matters worse, the vice chairman, who worked together with me, passed away in an accident 2 months after taking office. As a result, I took over all the business operations. The first thing I faced as an executive was an important policy that shook the city gas industry. The main focus of the policy was to introduce the gas industry into a competitive system. It was a very serious issue to be my first experience when I became an executive. In the midst of difficulties, I was fortunate enough to carry out my duties smoothly with the help of acquaintances, the support of the chairman, and the heads of member companies. Working on industrial restructuring, I gained confidence in my work. With responsibility and a lot of work to do, I could not afford to pay attention to my college lectures. I had to give up some lectures. I gave them up mostly on my own, and because other professors did not give me lectures. I had been a part-time lecturer for 12 years in university, but I had no hope of becoming a professor. When the vice chairman who had been in an accident passed away, I stood by the bed in the hospital room and saw the moment of death. He was barely breathing in unconsciousness, but his heart stopped. I went up to his bed in the hospital room, pressed his chest, patted him on the chest, and his family called in a nurse. Yet, he was unrecoverable and left the world. I used to recall the words of the vice chairman, who was usually tearful. I bought some land in Yongpyong. After I get all my children married, and when I retire from work, I will go into the countryside and live there with my mother and wife. He used to shed tears when he talked about his mother, who escaped from North Korea and had a hard time living here. The fact that his family was refugees and that he was extremely concerned about them made my heart hurt even worse. A year later, the chairman of the association also passed away suddenly. In the end, I was the only one left among the 3 executives who took office at the same time. I felt again that death was not a matter of age, and that the human being was nothing but a part of nature. I felt like they were always around me. It then seemed that souls existed.